Encountering the heartbreak of hearing my students perpetuate colorism, whether it was towards themselves or each other, that led me to blogging. Right, I had no idea. I had never spoken about colorism publicly before, so I had no idea how people would respond. I was afraid. I was like, "Oh my gosh, people are gonna think have low self esteem and that I don't love myself, or they're gonna say I'm airing dirty laundry, or I'm all the things, creating division." But I was like, I gotta say something. It's like it's pulling on my heart to speak up. And so when I spoke up, the first thing that clued me in that it was necessary to keep going down that path was that people really got angry. People were that I considered friends were cussing me out on Facebook and telling me, "How dare you bring up this topic?" and "Shame on you. There's so many other important things to talk about." And I was like, "Oh, this kind of visceral reaction, this kind of um, like deep trigger means that there's something there." And the less we talk about it, the more triggering it's going to be if we ever do try to confront it in the future, right? I think the reason why people have such intense reactions to colorism is because there isn't enough opportunities to release the pressure of what's actually happening, what's actually underneath the surface.
This is We're Not Okay, a community of healing. I am one of your hosts, Justin Stewart, and as always, I am joined by my co-host,
Dr. Antija Allen.
and we are thrilled over the moon to welcome Dr. Sarah Webb to the podcast. For those that are unaware, Dr. Webb is an international expert on colorism who helps businesses, schools, and organizations strengthen their DEI efforts by providing education and training on colorism, texturism, featureism, and intersectionality. So that means we got a lot to talk about, folks. So through her work at Colorism Healing, she's created powerful pathways for learning and transformation, making it easier for institutions and individuals alike to recognize and address the biases that too often go unnamed. So, with all that said, again, welcome, Dr. Webb. It is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and talking about this important topic with you all.
Sure enough, sure enough. So, before we get into the weeds, before we get into the nitty-gritty things, how are you? How are things? How have you been? I know we talked a little bit about it off mic, but just how are you feeling uh, this fine day or this afternoon for us?
Yes, I am feeling well. I am, as I was telling you earlier, I am waiting for my editor to give me feedback on my book. So I'm enjoying the time before that happens, and being able to focus and getting other things done in the meantime. So,
Okay. Well, again, it's a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us. So as we kick into gear, as we said, as we were listing off your accolades, which we can only give it snippet to, we would definitely charge others to look into you. Um, we wanted to get more into your background and when it came to your journey, when it came to the topic of studying colorism. Again, as we talked about in the intro with colorism healing, which we'll get into after this. But can you give us a little bit your pathway and how you reached that point where colorism is something that you wanted to study and that's something that you wanted to give back to the universe.
yes. So I always start with the fact that I was experiencing colorism my entire life, but I didn't have language for it. I didn't have a word for it. I certainly didn't have any historical context or research. And unfortunately, no one around me was really talking about it because I grew up in a multicolored family. My mom and sister are lighter skinned. We would occasionally bring it up when people would assume I was the cousin instead of my mom's actual daughter, right? But for years, all the way into my early 20s, I just thought, okay, I just gotta get over this thing, I guess, or it's just happening and I guess it's too taboo to talk about. But what prompted me to pay attention and what kind of woke me up to the fact that it wasn't just a personal problem was I was teaching high school. And so it was my first full time job after grad school. And I was hearing my students make comments that made me say, oh, this wasn't just my generation. This wasn't just something I observed that was a fluke, right? At that point, I was like, if this is happening to yet another generation, then it can't just be a fluke. It can't just be something that happened in my little area of town or within my social circle. My students were very direct and explicit about saying things like, oh, I don't like myself because I got too dark over the summer, right? So they were saying very overt things, or I wish I was light skinned like my mom. And so hearing my students not only, sometimes you can kind of read between the lines and you can tell that a student might have self esteem trouble. But the fact that they were saying these things as if they were reporting on the weather that day made me realize just how deeply entrenched it was. And as a teacher, my mind automatically went to, well, who's going to teach them better, right? And so that made me want to start talking about the issue in a public way. And I acknowledge that there are scholars in particular who have been doing work on colorism for years, even decades before I jumped in, because this was around 2011, 2012. But because it was primarily for an academic audience, things like my 16-year-old high school students weren't necessarily going to read it. And so I went the blogging route, just to make the information more widely and publicly accessible. But I think in the years since then, because celebrities have taken up the issue, social media has, people can talk about whatever they want. And so from 2012 to 2025, there's definitely been an increase in conversations, which I'm really excited about, but still a lot more ground to cover on that front.
No, I think just the aspect, and when you say with families, I think specifically, maybe if we're talking about our three families while we're sitting here, I think even for myself and myself being I have a fair complexion. I have cousins that have a darker complexion. I might even think back to a story where a cousin who has a darker complexion, she was just out with her child who has a fair complexion. And I think they were approached by someone that was just thinking that, oh, because there's a different tone, like, oh, are you the nanny? Like, are you the babysitter? As opposed to, no, this is my child. Like,
Yeah.
this is my daughter. So it's just these types of, like you said, some people can just, you're so used to being bombarded. In some families, people joke about it, so it's kind of like, okay, I can't be sensitive about it. But as you were talking about being in the classroom, it's something that impacts people very
Mhm.
deeply. It starts a lot of times in that time of being in your adolescence, going through school, but it's something that we always carry with us into our older years. So I guess with that intro, for those that aren't familiar, when you're defining colorism, how would you go about defining what colorism is? And then on top of that, how would you distinguish it from, or how would it kind of tie to racism if we could do that as well?
Yes. So, because race, the idea of race is a social construct, is what I like to say. But skin tone is a biological fact. And so it's interesting to me that as a culture, as a world, really, we focus so much more on the social construct of race. And we kind of think that the biological fact is a secondary thing. But when we consider the fact that different countries, different cultures, different nations, people around the globe have slightly different concepts of race, right? Like what's considered a race is very different in South America and Central America than it is in the United States. I think the US is kind of unique across the globe in terms of how we do race here with the rule of hypodescent, aka the one drop rule. And there are reasons why that came into being. But in the US context specifically, and in other, westernized cultures, I always inform people, I remind people that you can be part of the same racial group, the same racial classification, and have very different skin tones as the other people of that same racial group or classification. So we talked about families, for example. I mentioned my sister. We have the same biological parents, same mother and father biologically. And so, according to how we do race in the US, we're the same exact race, right? Same exact ancestry. But our skin tones are very different, several shades different. And because of that difference in our skin tones, we are treated differently, despite the fact that we're both Black Americans, right? And so that's what colorism is, and that's why it's different from racism. Because even though we are the same race, we still have different experiences of moving through the United States, and how we experience racism can also vary slightly depending on our skin tone. And I think when we talk about defining colorism, it is important to think of it as an ism, the same way that classism, sexism, racism, ableism are all isms. And so there's a systemic component to it. And so a lot of us experience it at home in our interpersonal connections with friends, or maybe, romantic relationships. and it's harder to sort of recognize or see sometimes that it also has systemic consequences and systemic impact. And I always remind people that for every racist stereotype that we know about, so a lot of us know about racist stereotypes, right? Like, oh, Black people are more likely to be criminals. The research studies really show us that those stereotypes are strongest for people who have broader features, curlier, more afro hair textures, and darker skin tones, right? And it's a tough conversation to have. And I use the very tragic example of someone like Eric Garner or Michael Brown or Botham Jean, right? All of these, men who unfortunately are well known because they were murdered at the hands of police officers, weren't just Black men. They were dark skinned Black men. Many of them were larger in stature, right? So we're talking about that intersectionality piece as well. And they also often had broader features, right? And so we look at that and we see that, okay, there's something more happening in these, not just interpersonal dynamics, but also in these systemic disparities and systemic forms of violence that have a correlation to skin tone and other features as well.
And I even when I look at, so when you talk about the systemic issues, I even look at the aspect of marketing. And fortunately, we've progressed drastically, but you look at things of when little girls have Barbie dolls, or even when we're looking at models, during a particular time, I guess for us, I would say for the 90s, I'm assuming 80s, whenever modeling started, it
Mhm.
was a certain look, it was a certain complexion, a certain skin tone. Or when it was Barbie dolls, there was a certain type of Barbie doll. Even within the household, we may purchase these particular dolls for our kids just because there was a certain association. Or kind of, if we take it a step further or step back, like when we look at the association of like the color spectrum of what we associate with the color white versus what we associate with the color Black, and kind of the negative connotations of Black, evil, white, holy, cleansed, things of that nature. And then you see how all of that ties together. I know we'll dig into it a little bit more into the conversation, but I just wanted to make sure that I did, say it again, just from what you've shared. So one of the things that we do appreciate is not only do you walk it, but you talk it. And as we talked in the beginning, you have Colorism Healing.
Yes.
So this is a global initiative. As you
Mhm.
said, we have a unique way of looking at it within the United States, but obviously a lot of things that we do is very unique. But the idea of colorism is something that is a global thing.
Yes.
This is an initiative that you launched in 2013. Could you give us a little bit more background of how your own personal experience led to the research, led to, you know what, this is something that I want to wrap my hands around. This is something that I want to tackle.
Yes. So encountering the heartbreak of hearing my students perpetuate colorism, whether it was towards themselves or each other, that led me to blogging, right? I had no idea. I had never spoken about colorism publicly before, so I had no idea how people would respond. I was afraid. I was like, oh my gosh, people are gonna think have low self-esteem and that I don't love myself, or they're gonna say I'm airing dirty laundry, or I'm all the things, creating division. But I was like, I gotta say something. It's like it's pulling on my heart to speak up. And so when I spoke up, the first thing that clued me in that it was necessary to keep going down that path was that people really got angry. People were that I considered friends were cussing me out on Facebook and telling me, how dare you bring up this topic, and shame on you, there's so many other important things to talk about. And I was like, oh, this kind of visceral reaction, this kind of um like deep trigger means that there's something there. And the less we talk about it, the more triggering it's going to be if we ever do try to confront it in the future, right? I think the reason why people have such intense reactions to colorism is because there isn't enough opportunities to release the pressure of what's actually happening, what's actually underneath the surface. And so opening up opportunities like this one where we can talk about it in a very candid, open way, I think across cultures helps to release some of that tension so that people can then enter the conversation with feeling a little less triggered by it, right? Because it becomes, okay, this is something we've practiced having conversations about. The other thing that made me want to dig into it, well, really, I'll say the first thing that opened my eyes to the real international reach and scope of colorism were the first people to respond to my blog, which surprised me, right? I thought, I was like, oh, okay, yes, other African Americans are going to respond, and maybe some of my white friends will be curious. But there were people from Brazil speaking Portuguese who were like, this is a thing. This is a really big deal here in our country, right? And then when I did the writing contest in 2014, people from India were reaching out, people from Australia, people from South Africa, people from Canada. And so it was me just kind of starting to talk about it and then getting responses and interactions and emails from people, from the Hispanic and Latino community, from, people who were either in the US but of a different race or culture than me, but also people abroad who saw these same things happening. And that the writing contest, the first year, again, I didn't know how much of a desire, how much of a hunger there would be to talk about this globally. So the first year of the contest was just United States. But when I saw like the emails coming in, like, hey, can I participate? I live in a different country. Can I submit? Then every subsequent year, I was like, we have to extend this to a global audience and make it have a global reach. So it was really just finding how it landed with people and just seeing how eager people were to finally have the conversation. The most common response I get is, we finally get to talk about this. Like, I've never said this before, is what I got from so many people. So that's what made me in the early years really start to commit to the path of colorism healing.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Um, so you talked about how, having experiences in your family, hearing from your students and their experiences, and, talking about how they like to be lighter and all this. Um, as someone who is dark skinned, I know for me, the most intense experiences I had with colorism were in elementary school. And unfortunately, I was in the same elementary school for 8 years. So it was a long, intense process. And with the same people in the same neighborhood. But just really thinking about that, that was when we were much younger, right? We were children. So
Mhm.
where did that come from? And so that's what I kind of want to dig into with you. Like, what are the historical roots of colorism? Where did this even start so that a, 8-year-old, 9-year-old is making fun of another 8 or 9-year-old because they're darker than them?
Yes. I I often offer this, and I don't know if people find it helpful, but I just always feel like it's so important to remind people that humans, like the grand history of humanity, is fraught, is rife with power struggles and people needing to fill the void in their ego by being better than someone else. And from every era of humanity has found a different way or an ongoing continuous way to make themselves feel like they're better than other people, right? So the construction of race is a well-known way for people to do that. Sexism, men, patriarchy, establishing themselves as the dominant sex. There have been so many ways that humans have tried to, for the sake of power, control, wealth, but also again just, I don't know, low self-esteem, needing to create hierarchies where they can be at the top or be above other people. And so when something like colorism, it is within the context of for a lot of cultures, colonialism. And colonialism in most cases was European colonialism, but it's also like Arab colonialism or different cultures within the Asian diaspora that have colonized each other, right? And so what I've you know, a summary is that whoever colonized a group of people gets to set the standard of beauty, gets to set the standard of what's considered professional, gets to set the standard of who's considered sophisticated and cultured, right? And so, in many contexts, that was a European country who said, okay, we're going to come in here and through force and violence, we're going to seize control of land, money, property, and we're going to, dominate the media. We're going to dominate the publishing industry. We're going to dominate the radio and all channels of communication. And so we have free reign to spread our ideology and our propaganda about beauty standards, right? You mentioned, Justin, about magazines and the beauty industry and all types of business and commerce where the colonial force had full control over that. And so they therefore had full control over the narratives that were spread across the cultures that they were oppressing. And when you have Europeans in many cases, or other cultures that are um, using their stark difference, their stark contrast. I always refer back to Thomas Jefferson's quote from Notes on the State of Virginia. And people, my students are always so shocked. They're like, "Oh, but I thought he was against slavery." And when I tell people, it's like, you can be against slavery and still dislike Black people, right? And that was very much Thomas Jefferson. He did not think we were his equal, even though he didn't also agree necessarily with the institution of slavery. And so the quote, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically saying the first difference which strikes us in the two races is that of color. And is this difference of no importance, right? And so, one, when white people say they don't see color, I'm like, no, you all have seen color for a very long time. And you have used differences in color to create these made up categories called race. And so, in that, in order to support their project of establishing themselves as superior, they included painting themselves as the superior race physically as well. So a lot of the pseudoscience, a lot of the so-called anthropology during colonial times used, and we saw it, in Nazi Germany as well, where they think they can measure your body parts, or look at your skin tone, look at your hair texture, look at how you eat, look at these different observable qualities, and therefore judge you are inferior because of the things we're documenting and observing. So that was the narrative they constructed. And through the subjugation and through genocide, through enslavement, and just very horrific, violent traumas, the people of color across the globe, for my ancestors, formerly enslaved people in the United States, having to survive those conditions meant we learned the narratives that would allow us to survive. We learned the ideologies that would allow us to exist, without going hungry, or without being able to provide for our children. And that part of that included this belief that straight hair is gonna give me the job, or that lighter skin will, make me seem less threatening to my employer, right? And these things get passed down from generation to generation, whether we mean to or not. So a lot of times people say, I know I'm going on and on and on, I'm gonna land the plane. A lot of times people say it starts at home. I agree with that. But in saying that, we have to realize that a lot of times it's not intentionally taught. Like, parents are not sitting their children down all the time, not necessarily, and saying, okay, here's the color hierarchy that I want you to learn. People with this skin tone are better than people with this skin tone, right? So it's more often picked up, to go more directly to your question, at young ages, based on, how your parents treat themselves, how they respond and talk about themselves, right? So if you have a dark-skinned mother who's like, "Ooh, I don't want to get any darker than I am," right? You're gonna hear that as a 4-year-old, 6-year-old, and say, "Okay, well, my dark-skinned mom doesn't like her skin tone. Well, why should I like mine?" And all types of examples and variations like of the sort. And so a lot of times the young children, because they are sponges, most of us have picked up and learned, and actually there are studies that talk about how children start to cultivate their understanding of what race, color, hair, and features mean as early as 2 and 3 years old, based on how the adults around them not only talk about it, but how they behave in response to those things. So if you have a white parent who tenses up and jerks their child away from a Black person, right? Like, that child subconsciously is going to say, okay, mom jerked me away from that Black man in the store, so I got to stay away from Black people. And so a lot of these things, again, it's not like there's a textbook on how to become colorist, how to become racist. But, for the sake of our survival as kids, we absorb all the things from the adults in our environment. And so if there are any parents listening, I encourage you to be intentional and to be mindful of the unintentional, the unconscious messaging that you might be sending to the children in your lives. That was a lot. Thank you for
I'm
sticking.
trying to figure out which piece to respond to. There's so much, but no, I appreciate all of it. I appreciate all of it. I'm sure our listeners do as well. So growing up in a home where my mother and my older brother are both lighter than I am, there was already subconscious messaging, as you mentioned, the going out in the sun. It's like, oh, you were sitting out there too long. Now you're getting dark. You don't want to get darker. Or even now, like at this age, oh, like you seem like you're lightening up. What do you use on your skin? It's like you lighten up a little bit. I'm like, that was never the goal, but okay. Thank you so much. I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. Like, what is my response supposed to be?
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I think about is when I was in elementary school, a movie that came out that touches on all of these different things that you're talking about. And that movie was School Days. And I'm
I
like,
knew
oh,
you
what
were
timing?
gonna say that.
Yes, 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 yes. And I was like, if my life was not hard enough, here comes School Days. And I like the songs, all right? I love the songs. But as a kid, I didn't really actually understand the movie. I don't know if any of us actually understood the movie as kids,
Right.
but the message that I think we all received, whether we were lighter or darker, was, well, light skin is beautiful, right? And dark skin is not. And clearly there is a clash between the two. And that's what I was experiencing in real time,
Mm-hmm.
like in real time at my school. And so for me, it was like it just kind of perpetuated it perpetuated this idea of, yes, lighter is better. Lighter is beautiful. Darker is not. And my mom was like, you are not getting a relax. I was like, can I get a relaxer? Can I just get my hair relaxed? Or at least my hair will be straight. And she was like, no. And I've never had a relaxer, even since then. But, no shade to anybody who has a relaxer. Enjoy your relaxer, straight hair, go for it. But it was part of that. I want to do as much as I can to fit into what is seen as beautiful. I'm not going to get any lighter, but I can straighten my hair possibly, right, with this relaxer. That might help me be more desirable
Mm-hmm.
or what have you. Now that was years ago. School Days came out years ago. And for anybody who has not seen the movie, spoiler alert, pause it, fast forward for 25 seconds. I'm going to say the ending. And at the end, Lawrence Fishburne yells, "Wake up!" Right? And I remember thinking that was the worst ending I ever. As a kid, I was like, "That's the worst thing I've seen. What does this have to do with anything?" Then I got older and I saw it, and I was like, "Oh, we need to wake up. Like, look at what we're doing. We
Mm-hmm.
literally have created a vision amongst ourselves based on skin tone, and we're fighting amongst ourselves, right? And just these beliefs we have. So for me, I feel like, but that was the 80s, that was the 90s, right? But what about now? Where do we still see that now? Where do we still see these subtle references, or maybe not so subtle references to colorism, whether it be in the media or what have you.
Yeah. Oh, see, so much there. Like, where do I start?
See, I had to match what you did.
um, I'll start by saying the school days reference. It does remind me, I think it's so interesting how you were saying you were living that in real time. It reminds me of the power of representation, of the power of media, right? And when it's used for bad, when it's used for propaganda, white supremacist propaganda or sexist propaganda, then we end up with the problems, with the disparities and inequities. But we can use media to shine a light on these things. We can use media to uncover the truth and to express the truth and then to reprogram, to rewrite certain narratives. And I think, a movie like School Days did a really good job of pointing out, right? Pointing to the wound, not necessarily showing us the way towards healing, not necessarily saying, okay, and here's how we pivot, right? Here's how this is the process for our awakening, right? It's one thing to say, hey, wake up. It's another thing to say, here's some rituals and strategies to help us raise our consciousness. And I think that's important work that can continue now. Again, social media is one of those things because it's somewhat more so than traditional media democratized in that most people can access it and get on there and say something, right? Without having to pitch a proposal to a producer somewhere and get rejected 50 times. And so, love it or hate it, it's based on the intention with which we use it. So many people have no intention at all. And they're just like, okay, whatever, just get on there, play around. Other people have overtly negative intentions. Other people have, intentions that maybe aren't inherently negative, but that have negative consequences, right? So I think about the people who just want to become famous really quick. And so that's when we see them posting the sensational colorist content on social media. There's this thing going around where you pop a balloon, and they love to clip out the clips where someone's saying, oh, I wouldn't date you because you're too dark, or I only want a light skin chick, right? So they clip out these sensational instances of colorism that go viral on social media, not because they are trying to raise awareness like Spike Lee was, but because they purely want the clicks and the views. So I think social media has fortunately given us a lot of opportunities to have the conversations and to talk about it and to have alternative forms of representation, but it's also rampant and rife with the colorism. And then there's a whole phenomenon of when you're anonymous and when you're not face to face with somebody, you have the audacity to say things you wouldn't otherwise say if you were in close proximity with them, right? And so, now we see it still in movies. It's still in the Hollywood arena as it was back in the 90s and 80s. But because of YouTube and things like social media, we we see it more often, right? For one, a movie like School Days didn't come around every day, right? It was like one long form piece of content that kind of had longevity. And now on a casual scroll, you will see 10 different instances of colorism as opposed to like one particular narrative. And I think that sets us up for danger, right? To have that much exposure to colorism now. Whereas before, you would see it in the media, but it wasn't like an onslaught. It wasn't the constant onslaught of that exposure. And I also think the rise of things like reality TV, where again, the point is not to tell a really interesting, compelling story. The point, again, is the sensationalism. The point is the drama. The point is the conflict for the sake of conflict. And so we've seen a lot of colorism in recent years come up in that platform or through that platform. I'm not a media insider. I'm not an industry insider, but I would assume that producers are people calling the shots. Again, they play up the drama, they play up the hype, and sometimes they create the perfect storm for these things to happen. And unfortunately, I've even seen, I shall not name names of programs, but I've seen people ask me to come on like they're very popular platforms, and the producers will reach out to me, and they won't even get my name correct, right? So again, like, what's your actual intention? Like, you're calling me Dr. So and so, and I'm like, that's not my name. But they explicitly say, we look for topics that are going to get a lot of engagement. We look for topics that are going to get people talking, right? And I say no to those engagements because I'm like, for me, colorism is not a clickbait topic that you use to drive up your views and your engagement numbers. If you're not platforming this topic for the purpose of education and healing, then I don't want to be involved, right? I might miss out on being exposed to millions of people, but it's worth it because I don't talk about this just because it might go viral. So we still see it. It's not well, I was gonna say it's not as in the forefront because there are opportunities to people are more aware now. I think the things like School Days helped with a little bit with awareness, but in the 80s and 90s it was still flying under the radar. But I think with the rise in exposure to colorism, there's also the rise in conversations about colorism. And it's really important that people have outlets and sources to go to so that those conversations are constructive, which I think is we still have a lot of work to do in that area because more conversations doesn't always mean more helpful or fruitful conversations.
No, and you make a good point because even this conversation, um, I'm going to be completely transparent. Justin was the one who wanted to have this conversation. And I was like, oh, we're going to talk about colorism. Okay. And I'm like, "Ugh." And one of the things I said to him, I was like, this is a deeply personal topic for me. But at the same time, it's a topic I don't really talk about, right? And I don't, and in my mind, I'm like, I don't feel like it has it definitely doesn't have the impact it had on me when I was in elementary school, right? Um, but still talking about it can be quite painful.
Yes.
But you need to talk about it, right? You need to talk just like anything else
True.
that pains you
Mm-hmm.
and that hurts and that is causing any type of uh I guess struggle or what have you, you do have to talk about it. So I am glad that we had this conversation. I'm glad that Justin reached out to you and yeah, see now he's smiling, he's proud of himself. For us to have for us to have this conversation. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So once we were preparing for this interview, I did look into some of the blogs I believe that you've written, and one of them talked about this idea of internalized colorism, right? And
And
so, and
yeah, you found a gem with that one.
yes, yes. And so, would you mind sharing a little bit about what internalized colorism is and what that might look like?
Mhm. Yes. Ooh, this is a juicy one, and it's so interesting because I do a lot of interviews on color over the past decade plus. I've done talked a lot about colorism. This one, as like important and as like substantial of a subtopic as it doesn't get talked about enough because so many people focus on like the external conflict of colorism, like, oh, how I'm treated compared to like my light skin sister, right? Which is important, like that's key. But this internalized colorism piece, so your audience is likely familiar with the concept of internalized oppression, right? And so internalized colorism is really specific, but it's the phenomenon where dark skinned people um, believe, accept that their darker skin is indeed inferior, right? Or their darker skin is just not as beautiful. So, and it can be based on the physical beauty aspect. So that's the most common one when we do talk about colorism and people are like, oh, dark skinned girls just need to love themselves. One, I'm like, okay, it doesn't stop there though, because we have to deal with the systemic nature of it too. But that's what most people think of when they think about healing colorism is like getting dark skinned people to love their dark skin, right? And so that's, I think, the most acknowledged form of internalized colorism is the beauty piece of it. But internalized colorism can also show up in terms of feeling like you have to then compensate for other people's bias, right? And so, you might have heard as a Black person, like, oh, you have to be twice as good as a white man to get the same job or to get the same pay. And so sometimes dark skinned people feel like they have to overachieve because we don't get the recognition. People don't see us, people don't value us as much just for who we are, and I have felt this way, right? And so I'll be vulnerable and transparent. And actually, I was writing a section on this in my book about, a lot of times you'll see a dark skinned woman who's like has a PhD and has achieved a lot and has gone on to do so many successful things in their career or just in life. And people will say, well, look, you're successful. That means colorism isn't a thing. Colorism didn't affect you. And I'm like, actually, it's because of colorism that I felt I needed to outperform all my peers, right? So that's one, I think, far less acknowledged form of internalized colorism where you don't necessarily have the self-loathing, you don't dislike your features necessarily, but you still believe that you're not enough, right? You still believe that in some way you have to be more than just like who you naturally organically are. You have to like either perform more. And I've even heard some dark-skinned women say that that's why they always have makeup on. That's why they always wear their hair straight, right? Because as a dark-skinned woman to feel seen, I feel like I have to put on these other performative measures in order to take up space in a room. And that pressure, that burden, right, is taxing and it leads to compounding problems elsewhere, right? When you feel like it also can impact relationships as well. So I've even seen dark skinned people feel like they either have to attach themselves to a light skinned partner or friend to have that sort of vicarious, privilege or access to spaces, but also the idea that you have to tolerate a certain level of mediocrity or a certain level of mistreatment, right? Because the narrative is, well, I'm not going to be able to do better for myself, or no one else is going to like show up for me in this way. And so it's not benign, I'll say. Internalized colorism is not benign. And so saying this with full compassion for anyone, whether you were on the side of like not liking your skin tone at all and not seeing yourself as beautiful, or whether it was more of a personality character type of manifestation, it leads to problems that I think we need to work on to heal from so that we can really be able to thrive and feel free in our skin, feel free in our bodies, and free in our lives. I think freedom is a big carrot for me in terms of like working with people to heal is, do you feel free when you choose that hairstyle? Does it feel like it's coming from a place of freedom of expression, or does it feel like an obligation that you're using to compensate or mitigate harm or judgment? I have to do this to avoid criticism. It's a very different feeling in your body to make a decision than, I'm doing this because I'm so attracted to the idea of makeup and the aesthetic of a certain style, right? And so, as you mentioned with the straight hair thing, it's not to judge like, oh, every woman with makeup and straight hair has internalized colorism. And so, for you listening, judging for yourself when you decide to put on your makeup or to not put on your makeup, does it feel like the choice and the decision is coming from a place of freedom within yourself, a place of freedom of self-expression? Or are you doing it because you're afraid that if you don't, you'll be criticized, judged, shamed, or alienated, right? And so I think that's the internal litmus test that people can use if they're trying to say, have I internalized colorism? Do I have some remnants of that? That's a way that people can judge for themselves.
Thank you. See, I picked a good, well, I shouldn't say I picked that. I didn't pick that topic, but still, but I definitely read that part of the article and I was like, this is something we need to talk about for sure. Um, so one other thing, because when you were talking, it made me think of this guy in high school who I thought was the most beautiful man on the planet. Um, he had dark skin. He had the S curl. Back then the S curl was everything in high school. I was like, oh, he had the S curl. He's just gorgeous. And one thing I noticed about him, I observed about him, was that he only dated outside of his race. He
Mm.
never dated anybody that was black. Forget light skin, dark skin. He only dated outside of his race. And then me and him became really good friends eventually. The crush died down as most high school crushes do. And I remember we were like in our mid to late 20s and we were having a conversation about this. And he's like, yeah, I know you liked me in high school. I was like, yeah, for like 5 minutes. But anyway, we were talking about it. And he said, I could have never been with you in high school because he was trying to get away from the experiences he had as a dark skinned male before he even came to high school. So for me, when I got to high school, I was like, whoo, breath of fresh air, totally different people, very diverse environment, ethnically, racially, personality wise, like everybody was so different and kind of doing their own thing, but it still was sitting with him. And even at that point, he was like, we couldn't have had a kid because if we had a kid, then they would have came out dark skinned. I'm like, first of all, we were in high school. I wouldn't think about having a kid with you. But but just that mindset of I have to pick someone who is outside of my race and lighter because I want to have a child that is lighter skinned so that they don't have the experience that I had. And I'm like, the fact that he is thinking that far ahead or was thinking that far ahead at that age, is that not a firm example or clear example of internalized colorism?
Yes. Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
man.
Yeah.
So you were educating me and I had to think, I'm like, wow, I need to call him. I'm not going to say his name. I need to call him and see how he's doing. Mm.
Yeah. Yes.
Think as we dig deeper into this, like now that we've kind of gone through the problem statement, it's kind of like, now what? Like, what do we do with all this information? Like, yes, I heard of it. And even when you all were talking, I was unfortunately thinking of fortunately, but unfortunately, thinking of the color purple. And I was like, oh, Sealy. And I was like, oh, Sealy. When I was thinking again, because I know we laud that movie or hold it to such a high thing, and it was even remade, but even the presentation of Sealy versus the presentation of her sister. And again, to what we've talked about to this stage. So it's just, as you mentioned, Dr. Sarah, the internal struggle of freedom versus fear of not being free to be who you want to be,
Yeah.
the internal struggle of authenticity of versus acceptance. Do I want to be authentic or do I want to be at the cool kids table? Do I want to be authentic or do I just want people to embrace me?
Mhm.
So what do we do? And obviously, for you being with the founder of Colorism Healing, that's why we're here to talk to you about it. So, when we're having these conversations about reprogramming, as you mentioned, rewriting, like reframing, when we look at cultural conversations about beauty, about identity, we could even say about privilege,
Yeah.
about hierarchy, when we're looking at the association of I am better than you because of the complexion of my skin, that internal division that we have within our cultural, that exists now, and it's something that we also see perpetuated in the mainstream of you may see actors and actresses like, are they bleaching their skin? Are they lightening? And regardless of what they choose to do with their life, it's how we perceive it. So how do we reframe these cultural conversations that have become so saturated in the fabric of our existence, how we want to procreate, as Antija was mentioning, as we may say, oh, I look at my light-skinned babies, like that type of pride. Like, how do we reprogram that type of thought that we have as we push forward, as we try and find a solution, as opposed to being steeped in the problem that just continues to permeate and be go as we have more and more, as we go further and further into the future.
Yes. So this is a perfect time to plug my book, unashamedly, unapologetically. What I do is I go through different sectors of life, family, work, school, and at the end of each chapter, I give you practical ways to start to revise the narrative and revise your behaviors and your actions and how you show up. And so, for the sake of time, because we're not going to go through each possible outcome or each possible strategy. And what I will say too is I always tell people you have to look at your unique situation. And so there's not going to be a one size panacea, one pill that everybody takes and the same outcome happens. So it depends first on like what you self assess. So let's start there. Everyone, you now have the awareness, right? So some of us already had the awareness, but now we have expanded awareness. And the first step, no matter who you are, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of your complexion, is to self assess. You have to get honest. You have to have the courage to look at your actual beliefs about skin tone, yours as well as others. You have to be honest. Well, have I said things offhand? Have I, commented on someone getting a tan or, looking lighter? Have I gravitated towards celebrities and singers who all look, lighter skinned with long straight hair? Look at your potential bias. So many people of every race and color have a bias based on skin tone specifically, right? So not even including our racial biases, but you as a dark skinned person can still have a negative bias towards other dark skinned people. So I just deeply encourage people not to assume that this doesn't affect you and to actually sit down after listening to this and do a catalog, do a review of your history. And even if you are someone who is lighter skinned, you still, can think about, well, how do I think about my skin tone? Do I derive self-esteem from the fact that I am a lighter, right? Because that's also unhealthy to base your self-esteem on a relative comparison to other people around you is not a healthy foundation for your self-esteem, right? And so what I say is everyone has internal work to do to unlearn this hierarchy from within themselves. So after you do your self-assessment, and maybe if you want to talk to a professional counselor, therapist, etc., as you do that work, go for it. Like, don't skip that step. The next thing, this is my favorite thing to tell people, is that in order to change your outputs, you have to change your inputs. And maybe if you're a geek or a nerd like me, I love the process of changing my inputs, right? And I I would pick a period of time like 6 months where I would go on a media diet, where I only consumed media with lead actresses who looked like me, right? I was like, oh, they have to be a dark skinned Black woman in the leading role, or I'm not going to watch it. I'm not going to watch the movie. I'm not going to watch the music video. I'm not going to watch the TV show unless the lead character is a dark skinned Black woman. So you can imagine I had a lot more time, a lot more free time with that being my parameters. But that's just one example. You don't have to take that specific route. But we have all, for decades at this point, people listening to this podcast have probably been alive for multiple decades. And so we've all been exposed to narratives. And so, one, reducing, finding the exposure that promotes the idea that lighter is better. Find where that shows up in your life, whether it's your social media accounts, the movies you watch, and reducing it gradually over time, right? Like maybe you watch one less reality show every quarter. Maybe you unfollow a few Instagram accounts every quarter, right? So reducing the amount of colorist content. And then at the same time, increasing and proactively seeking out the brands, the companies, the accounts, the channels, the movies, the creators that really portray dark-skinned individuals through a loving lens, right? Through a healthy, constructive, human lens. And so that takes time. That's the third thing I'll say is to be patient and persistent, right? Because so often I know we hear something like this and we want to be done tomorrow. I, let's solve it today. Let's solve it tonight, and it's not going to happen like that, right? Unfortunately, it could take years before you, depending on where you start, right? Which is why self awareness is like my number one, thing to preach. Self awareness always, because depending on where you start, it could be a couple of years before you really start to feel like you've unlearned, like you've untethered yourself from those ideas and beliefs, and attitudes about how you look or about how the people around you look. But it's worth it. It is so, so worth it to stick with it over time. And then I'll also say, in terms of an outward action and external action, is as you listen to more conversations like this about colorism, you'll start to notice it more, which is really good. Because when you notice it, then you can say something to the people who are perpetuating colorism in that moment. You can say something when you notice your nurse ignoring the dark-skinned person in the emergency room, right? Like, hey, I noticed this, dark-skinned patient asked for water and they haven't gotten water yet. Like, you know what I mean? So I say that always take into account as well your own safety. I'm always like, yes, speak up, say something, but if it puts you in harm's way, if it's a threat to your life, if use your own discernment there. But as you start to notice where colorism is showing up, start to cultivate the courage to call it out. And the importance of calling it out, this is really important. It's not always to change the mind of the person who's doing the colorism, right? That's a big mistake people make. There's like, well, I gave up on talking about colorism because people don't change their minds, they don't listen, they get defensive, right? The real magic, the real power in speaking up is not because the person who did or said something colorist is going to stop and realize the error of their ways and like sit at your feet and learn all there is to learn about colorism. It's because someone else who experienced it or witnessed it needs an ally in that moment, needs to know that there's someone in this room who thinks differently, needs to know that there is an alternative perspective to what this harmful person just did, needs to know that, okay, someone has seen what I've seen, and someone else thought it was important enough to say something. You could save someone's life by being the person to speak up in that moment, whether it's on their behalf or not. Because a lot of times people will say something colorist and it's not directed at anyone in particular, right? Like they're not calling you out specifically, but they say the colorist thing in front of dark-skinned people, in front of anybody really, and other folks are left to deal with the weight of that. But especially if there are dark-skinned people around, even if people aren't talking about them specifically, it does harm, it does damage in that moment, right? And so if you're in their company, if you're out to dinner with them, if you're out shopping with them, if you're at the beach with them, you voicing an alternative perspective to the colorism that's happening could be enough to heal and show support to that darker skinned person, or to educate other people of all skin tones. Icing on the cake, best case scenario, the person who perpetuated the colorism also learns, also course corrects, and promises not to do it again. But it's okay if that's not the outcome, because there are so many other important reasons and important impact that can happen when we have the courage to stand up and say, hey, it's not right what you're saying, or it's not right the way you're treating these students, or all the ways that colorism can show up. So there's a lot.
No, we appreciate you sharing the different strategies because you gave us a little preview, as you said, to the book. We didn't want you to give it all away, but you gave us a nice little preview that many of us can grab onto, and they're like, all right, so when the book comes out, I'm going to get the rest of this information.
Hmm.
But for right now, I'm going to use what she shared with me for
Yes,
for uh for a discount.
ma'am.
Oh gosh, we need to wrap up. It's the time is dwindling away. One thing that you talked about was an initiative that you do, and I see it as an initiative or a campaign that you do, which is the um following only certain influencers if they're dark skinned. And I think there was something I may have seen on your page where it was like you had different maybe it was different items. I don't know if it was clothing or something that came from different dark skinned influencers or business owners. Is that was that something that you did?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so like those types of things I think are have been very helpful in bringing awareness, but also combating colorism. What are some other movements or campaigns or things that you've noticed? The only thing that I can think of, other than what you shared, and this was many, many years ago as well, because I thought about it, I was like, this is over 10 years ago. I don't know if you remember the documentary called Dark Girls.
Yes. Of
And so
course.
for me, yeah, and my one of my professors from grad school was actually in that documentary as one of the experts. He taught cross cultural psych. Shout out to Dr. Daryl Rowe,
Yeah.
uh, for his expertise in that documentary. And I felt like that did a great job of raising awareness about
Mhm.
colorism, not just in the U.S. but as you mentioned, globally,
Yeah.
and just having that conversation. And so, have you seen anything else since then? Because that was over 10 years ago, and other than the work that you're doing that's helped to raise awareness, progress, sorry, or combat colorism.
Yeah, so I have to shout out Bill Duke and Chanson D. Berry, who produced the Dark Girls documentary, and Shel Bradford, who was a line producer on that, because it was seeing a trailer for that documentary that led up to my first blog post. So Colorism Healing might not have existed if they hadn't come out with that documentary. So again, folks, speaking out about colorism can literally change people's lives. You might not see immediate results from the people around you, but you never know who's going to see, witness you speaking your truth on this issue, and like their whole life changes. I'm speaking of myself, right? Um, but definitely there have been some documentaries since then and some movies too, some fictional narratives that explore the topic from a first person. I was actually did a call just about an hour ago with a playwright, an organization that is hosting a showing of the play Yellow Man, which explores internalized, anti-blackness and colorism as well. So there have definitely been a lot of, additional resources, even people like Lupita Nyong'o coming out with her children's book Sulwe, where she is kind of an adaptation of her personal story. So that's the beautiful thing. And even celebrities like Gabrielle Union and Viola Davis in their books, they talk about colorism. So we've seen since Bill Duke and Shanton DeBerry put out Dark Girls, we have seen more people with bigger platforms taking up the issue, even if they're not talking about it on an ongoing basis. There have been pockets or instances where they have given the issue of colorism a larger platform because of personal experience are talking about it. But also internationally, one of my favorite things that I've seen is, people in countries where skin bleaching is a epidemic, right? Where it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and there are skin lightening products and everyday lotions and everyday soaps. Like you can't buy an everyday cosmetic without it having some kind of bleaching component, right? And they have massive celebrities who get endorsements, like brand deals with skin bleaching products. So people in places like India, they have organizations that have started petitions to their national governments, to their federal governments to either ban the products, to ban the marketing of those products, to take down the advertisements. And there have been CNN has a entire series that they've done on skin bleaching specifically, and so they list all the countries that have banned skin bleaching products or the ingredients that go into skin bleaching products. So I really am excited about those initiatives, and even in the United States, I think one of the congresswomen from Minnesota wanted to ban skin bleaching here in the U.S. as well. So seeing those petitions and people working on it at a geopolitical level in that way is really exciting as well. And there was one more. Let's see if I can remember what it was. Oh, I do want to shout out all of the other creators, the content creators who've taken up this issue. Most of them dark skinned Black women, oftentimes also Black men, but mainly dark skinned Black women, um, have also increased the amount of awareness on this, right? So even though I have like Colorism Healing as an initiative, and it started before Instagram was a thing. It started before, a Facebook page started as a blog first. There are other YouTubers with hundreds of thousands, millions of views. There are other Instagram accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers who have really also contributed to raising that awareness. And so I just want to shout them all out. I can't name them all, and list them all, but they're out there. And if anyone wants to find accounts or YouTube channels where they can, again, get that input, increase that input and that awareness, especially if you like pop culture. I think that's a differentiator, is that a lot of them are like really young, like Gen Z and younger. And so they talk a lot about the rappers and the singers and the reality TV shows, which I'm not as interested in those things. And so I think there's a unique audience that they tap into that I don't necessarily have a desire to really, you know, immerse myself in pop culture because it's so colorist, which is precisely why I'm not involved in it. But if you like TV, media, pop culture and music, there's so much content out there that where you can continue to educate yourself and be involved in the conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. We are going to make sure that we can seek out as many as possible and try to tag them,
Yeah.
when we post this
I can
post
send
this
you the ones that
episode.
I'm most familiar with. And it won't be an exhaustive list, but there are definitely some that are noteworthy that I think people can know about. And I don't know if they're like actively making content now, but their content might be available in archives and stuff like that.
Oh, appreciate it. Believe it or not, we are over time and we're at the last question, but this question is really short. And I feel like one of our most important questions. Dr. Sarah, what brings you joy?
Ooh, where do I begin? I have been leaning into joy, so I will try to keep it short. One thing that brings me joy is, I will say music, right? In order to, for the sake of simplicity in this moment, I think music is a universal language, right? Even if you don't speak the language of a song lyrics, you can enjoy that song and you can catch the vibes of that song. And I also think there's something about how the human brain likes the sonic patterns and the harmonies in music, and it literally like massages your mind, like, oh yes, patterns and nice pleasant sounds and harmonies. So I think it's good for like regulating our nervous systems, but also like dancing. I challenge anyone to feel bad while you're dancing. If you can manage that, let me know, because I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to feel bad and be dancing at the same time. So for that reason, I would say music has been a staple in my self-care practice.
Thank you. Those are two things that bring me joy too, especially when I'm doing both of those in the kitchen. I don't know why,
It's the
but
kitchen. It's
it's something about the kitchen. I don't know. I literally have a sign that I found at a thrift store recently that says, "We dance in this kitchen." I
in
was
the
like, I have to
kitchen
have this
while
sign.
eating cashews.
Yeah. Oh, look. Okay, we're the same person. I'm so glad we met.
Ah, so fun.
Oh, but thank you so, so much for this dialogue, for everything that you provided to us through sharing your knowledge, sharing your experiences, sharing about your new book that's coming out that we'll be sure to make sure we promote and purchase. Um, but thank you just so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know that I've taken a lot from it. I'm sure that our listeners have as well. And I know Justin probably wants to say something.
I'm glad I reached out to you.
Yes. It's so interesting to see your
Just
person.
have to take credit.
Justin's very like, mm-hmm. It is what it is.
But no, the learning, the lessons, the laughter, all of it, the timeliness, we couldn't ask for more. So thank you.
And to you all, I am so grateful to anyone who's willing to have this conversation. Part of my mission is spreading awareness, and so when you decide to use your platform to talk about this, it means the world. And again, it is going to change lives. The fact that you are giving space for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.